So I mean, I agree with the previous panelists suggesting that there is an idea that we need to talk about when it comes to the cost and benefits that will accrue to Ontarians. Right now, Hydro One is one of the 3 largest income-generating assets that the province owns. It adds in about, on average, over the last 15 years, $400 million to our balance sheet from the government. It generates this revenue. We use this money to pay for things like public services, healthcare, education, those sorts of things. In essence, what the government is saying is, right now so they put together a panel headed by the past CEO of TD Bank, Ed Clark. And it was the intellectual argument around why we should privatize this and why we should sell 60% of Hydro One. And the argument goes something like this. We have reached our borrowing capacity. So we can't borrow anymore, so what do we need to do? We need to sell things. We need to sell shares in Hydro One so we can take this money, recycle it, put it into transit. That's their stated goal. It is problematic to say the least. The idea that somehow we've reached our borrowing capacity is a silly idea. We still put out lots of bonds, and the financial markets tell you how credit-worthy you are or not, based on the interest rates they'll demand when they lend you money. Over the last 25 years, Ontario's borrowing rate is at its lowest. The average rate is 2.9%. The reason for that is because Ontario, as a government, has far cheaper borrowing rates than any private sector person, private sector company, private sector person. The base of Ontario, it's credible because Ontarians, as a tax base, can fund that. They're never going to not pay. So when Ontario needs to go and spend, the government's proposed $130 billion over the next 10 years on infrastructure. It can do one of 2 things. It can go and borrow that money, or it can sell assets and use that money and then go and pay for that transit. It borrows money far cheaper than anyone else out there. When it sells 60% of Hydro One, the only reason that someone's going to buy 60% of Hydro One is because they expect to make a killing. On average, you're expecting to make around 6 to 8%. So there's a relatively large differential there between what the government could spend in terms of borrowing versus what it's going to have to pay these private investors. So how is that going to affect our bottom line? The government has acknowledged this will hurt their balance sheet. Like in this Ed Clark report, this infamous Ed Clark report, it very clearly lays out this will bring in less revenue. Their hope is, this is their stated idea, that investing in transit infrastructure will help us because it creates such a bottleneck. Now, I don't disagree with the fact that we do need to invest in transit infrastructure. My perspective is that we could just use traditional borrowing means, as we have for 100 years now, as we have in the Great Depression, to borrow in our standard ways. The other problem with this is that the government wants to spend $130 billion over 10 years on infrastructure. It's going to sell 60% of hydro, and it'll get about $9 billion. No, $9.50. $4 billion will go towards debt repayment, and $5 will go to infrastructure. Oh, sorry, other way around. 5 for debt repayment, 4 for infrastructure. $4 billion out of 130 is 3% of what they plan on spending on infrastructure. Where are they going to come up with the other 97%? It's a question that's remained unanswered. The general argument is that we should just borrow through traditional means. We do it cheaper, we do it more effectively, and that makes sense. This is going to become a very slippery slope. Once you start selling things, the idea that we're going to retain 40% ownership isn't in fact true. The government has said that we are going to, when it comes out in an IPO, that they will hold 40%. In the budget enabling legislation that was that came out about 2-3 weeks ago, there's a particular passage in there that says if no other company or private investor can own more than 10%. And there's another little subsection that says, oh, by the way, if Ontario falls below 10%, then we can never go above that again. And it's sort of nonsensical. Like, what does that mean? It seems to be the case that when the government sells 15% this year, 15% next year, 15%, 15%, if additional shares are put out, the government will originally hold 40%, but that will be diluted. So the idea that we will continue to hold 40% is a sham. We will not. So it's going to be problematic, this idea that we are still going to somehow have ownership or control over these things. That's not going to happen. So the government still has to find 97% to spend its $130 billion on infrastructure. That's going to come with other asset sales. Thank you.